Okay, this screencast is going to pick up with the U.S.'s role in supporting South Vietnam when France was still there. So potentially where you left off in class yesterday, you may be able to fast forward at this point. So obviously, there is a communist threat in South Vietnam. We have, communist North Vietnam beginning to mobilize. We also have the Viet Cong present in South Vietnam. We see France needing help in defending South Vietnam and maintaining it as a non-communist nation. Keep in mind that we don't really necessarily care about France keeping its imperial territory. We more or less are concerned about containment and not allowing communism to spread. So Eisenhower is the first president to kind of get America somewhat involved in this conflict. We are going to begin sending hundreds of military and political advisors to South Vietnam with the intention of helping them to restructure their government, build up a military of their own to be able to defend themselves against any sort of communist uprising or threat. So we are not sending active troops or boots on the ground or any sort of military forces. This is just an advisory role. These are only advisors that we're sending. Pretty soon after our involvement in sending the advisors into South Vietnam, France is actually going to bow out and realize that this is not a worthwhile investment for them to be pouring in these resources to maintaining control of South Vietnam. They have a lot going on after World War II. They're not really at liberty to be able to afford any sort of big conflict trying to keep a hold of South Vietnam. So they remove themselves from the situation altogether, leaving just us to help South Vietnam defend itself. One thing the United States is going to start doing is building up a South Vietnamese military force known as the ARVN, that is ARVN, which stands for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. So just another military title, okay? You have the NVA in the north, the communist rebel group in the south known as the Viet Cong, but the official South Vietnamese army will be the ARVN. Building the ARVN was a pretty big headache for the United States. There are a lot of problems with this South Vietnamese military force. They lack experience. Therefore, they lack expertise. They're inefficient. There's some corruption amongst their ranks, and they're just overall kind of more dedicated to themselves than to the country as a whole. So there's just a lot of confusion and kind of disorganization about the ARVN. The biggest overall problem with the ARVN, however, is that we are not training them properly to be able to defend themselves against the communist uprising that's coming, as we are very used to the, direct military presence that was Hitler and the Nazi regime in World War II with Blitzkrieg and them making their presence known right away. The enemy in South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, they will engage in what is known as guerrilla warfare. That is not gorilla like the animal. It's guerrilla, Guerilla. It is a style of warfare that involves like surprise attacks and ambushes, and we are not really used to that style of fighting. We're training the ARVN to fight the style of fighting we are used to and accustomed to, but that's not what we're going to encounter in our own military experience there. So they will be ineffective against the enemy, which is one of the number one reasons we will end up losing the war. The next president we're going to talk about is Kennedy for the rest of the screencast. And his involvement will change a little bit in terms of how the U.S. comes to be involved. When he first takes over for Eisenhower, he very much wants to just keep the status quo of what Eisenhower was doing, maintain Eisenhower's containment policies, keep up our advisory role in Vietnam, not military role. But unfortunately, during Kennedy's presidency in the early 1960s, things in South Vietnam are getting worse. It is deteriorating quickly. The Viet Cong are beginning to take more direct action. There are incidents of kidnappings and ambushes. So this is all putting increased pressure on Kennedy to do something about what's happening in South Vietnam. So he will implement what is called Project Beef Up. Project Beef Up is essential or relative to what Kennedy does, in which, as part of Project Beef Up, He increases the number of the ARVN. He increases the number of advisors we are sending to South Vietnam. You know, Eisenhower sent a couple of hundred. Now we're going to see up to 16,000 political and military advisors being sent to South Vietnam as part of our advisory role. He sends the ARVN, helicopters, planes, other military resources, and he also encourages Diem to take some social and political reform to make himself more likable by his own people. As we discussed, he's a pretty weak leader overall. Even with all of this increased efforts, we're still maintaining an advisory role. We are not yet sending military troops. Obviously, there are cases of combat against these military advisors in which the Viet Cong act up and there are attacks happening, but we are not yet officially involved on like a military scale just yet. There are some constraints to JFK's policies. Obviously, we already mentioned that Diem is hard to work with and a bit ineffective as a leader. We already mentioned that the ARVN was also kind of a constant problem and a headache to the American advisors. Two other kind of key constraints and reasons that this is not working for Kennedy. You know, in terms of our focus, we're not as focused on what's happening in Vietnam. If you kind of consider the other issues the Kennedy administration was doing or dealing with that we learned about in other parts of previous units, such as what's happening in Cuba with the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, such as what's happening with the civil rights movement in the United States on a domestic level. What's happening in Southeast Asia is just not at the forefront of American minds, and so we're not making it a priority, so we're not able to give that full attention. Also, an anti-war movement is beginning to develop at home, where you have Democrats, particularly liberal Democrats, kind of opposing our involvement in Southeast Asia and in this conflict. So you lack the support we saw America having and rallying like in things like World War II. So these are all things kind of going against JFK and his efforts here. Things will take a big turn with the exit of Diem as the South Vietnamese leader. We've mentioned he's ineffective. I don't even need you to know this deep of like the backstory, but I think the final straw for Kennedy in the U.S. was there was this huge battle with the Viet Cong and the ARVN lost, but Diem publicly claimed it as this victory for the ARVN, which is a lie. So he like blatantly lied to his people just to gain support, and the U.S. just realizes things are really bad with Diem and things are not looking good in terms of having an organized and strong leader in government. So because of this, Kennedy kind of authorizes this coup or overthrowing of Diem, where he gives the CIA permission to like train the South Vietnamese and help the South Vietnamese to overthrow Diem themselves, because they hate, they don't like him as their leader, so they want to get rid of him. Kennedy made it clear he doesn't want anyone to die. He just wants him to be removed from power forcibly, since he's not going to give up himself probably. But in the overthrowing process, Diem does end up being killed. And unfortunately for Kennedy, he himself is assassinated just 2 weeks later. The reason I say that is, obviously, this is a bit of a cluster now with Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, being overthrown by his own people and executed. Now we just have this game of like musical chairs for power in South Vietnam. Instead of like stabilizing the political scene, things are just more and more chaotic. Kennedy honestly just wants to like, probably as soon as Diem was assassinated, he probably wanted to like pull out all of the U.S. troops and all the U.S. advisors and say, forget it, like it's not worth it. But unfortunately, he himself being assassinated so soon after, we're going to see the next president, Johnson, actually respond by escalating and increasing the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which is the war that we know it as today in the history textbooks. It's interesting to think that if Kennedy hadn't been killed, would we even be learning about a unit called the Vietnam War right now, as we had not yet really been involved on a military scale just yet. But that's about to change with Johnson, as we will learn in class tomorrow. So please write down any questions you have, and I will see you all tomorrow.